Alright, so this video, we're talking about the Jesus lens of the Bible. So, a new way to read the Bible, I guess it shouldn't be the new way, but it's a way that people don't really use very often. I kind of just discovered myself, and that is reading the Bible with the intent to find Jesus in the stories and the verses and all of the different events. So, if we look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, you often hear from, especially from non-believers, like they don't relate, they don't have, but what you actually see is the Old Testament is physically a mirror of the New Testament spiritual truths. So in the Old Testament, the stories that we see, they're physical, and in the New Testament, those same stories happen, but they're spiritual. And what I mean by that is there's a whole list I have of stories that if you look into them with the intent to find Jesus in that story, well, you'll find the spiritual truth of that story. So first, let's start with this. Just a very basic rule that Jesus is the main character of the Bible. So throughout the whole Bible, Jesus is the main character. And many people, they want to be the main character when they read it. They want to get inspiration. They want to get like, hey, I'm David. I'm the one that defeats all the giants in my life, and I'm the one that's like strong. The truth is, even in the story of David and Goliath, Jesus is David, and the people are the trembling army on the sidelines that are too scared to join the battle against this big enemy. We're the ones that are trembling, scared, while Jesus does all the work for us. So real quick, as we establish this rule, everything was created in, for, and through Jesus. And in Colossians 1:16 it says, "For by him were all things created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created by him and for him, and he is before all things, and by him all things consist." Meaning everything, like literally everything. So here's a good rule. When you read the Bible, there's so much confusion, there's so much, this is a metaphor, that's an allegory, this means that, it doesn't really mean that. You hear that all the time. And if you want to get rid of the confusion, start with reading the Bible literally. Just take everything literally. And then, after you take it literally, you can start to look for the extra layers and the different meanings and the metaphor. And as you grow in the Spirit, God will actually reveal different layers of different things to you. So you may have one thing that you read, and it means one thing, and then later on you read it, and it actually means something else, and now you got another layer, and there's another spiritual truth behind it. And all these different things can have multiple layers, but start with taking it literally. That'll make everything much easier. And even the people that'll say, when I say take it literally, they might say, well, yeah, then, you look at the Old Testament, all the laws and all the things and all the, don't do this and don't eat that and all, but even then, if you take the Bible literally, you fast forward into Romans, and Paul says, in Romans 6:14, "For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under the law, but under grace." So even taking the complete Bible literally, it does not contradict itself, because you can read the laws and read later that you're not under the laws. You can read about them, but it tells you that you're not subject to those laws that the Jews in the Old Testament were. So still, the rule of literal still holds. So going off this idea that, we're not the main characters, Jesus is the main character. We'll go over a few little stories, and I'll just kind of glance over them pretty quick, not too crazy. But let's start with Abraham and Isaac. That's a good one. You got the father who is asked to sacrifice his only begotten son, and Isaac walks up the hill with the sticks of his sacrifice, the bundle of firewood. And then you got Jesus, who is God's only begotten son, who walks up the hill carrying the stick of his cross, like the wood. The wood is his altar, his sacrifice altar. So Jesus is Isaac in this story, and God the Father is Abraham. And then even Jacob and Esau. This one took me a while. I didn't really understand this for the longest time. But in the Jacob and Esau story, it's actually redemption. And what you got is Esau sells his blessing for a bowl of soup, I think it was. And you can actually tie that back into Adam, who sold his dominion and his birthright over the earth for an apple. Each each sold their dominion over and their blessing for essentially nothing, just some food. So what Jacob does is he actually is able to regain the blessing by using the goat, the fake goat skin it talked about where Isaac thinks that it's Esau and he re-blesses him, and so he regains his blessing. Well, what that's saying is we are all Jacob in that we're the younger, and we are able to, through the skin of Jesus, regain our blessing with the Father. So we are saved in Jesus, and Jesus is the goat skin in that story that allows us to regain the blessing of redemption. Hopefully that makes sense. Like I said, David and Goliath. Well, we got a seed of David, or what it is it's the sin and death battle. So as Jesus is David, he slays Goliath, the monumental giant of sin and death that nobody else can defeat. And where we are in this story, we're actually the trembling army that can't actually do anything or fight for ourselves. We can't win the victory for ourselves. We need David, Jesus, to come in and win this victory, so that when Goliath is slayed, all of the army behind, and the deal was, if send out one champion versus Goliath, and whoever wins, the rest of the armies don't have to fight. So when Goliath is defeated, all of the armies behind him cannot attack all the armies that were behind David, which is us, the people. So in that way, sin and death is destroyed, and we're no longer under the power of that. So even Samson, think about Samson. At the very end of Samson's life, he pulls down the temple and kills himself in the process. And did not Jesus say that I will destroy this temple and rebuild it in 3 days? He said that. So what does Jesus do? He dies and destroys the temple and rebuilds it in 3 days. Noah's Ark. So even Noah's Ark, you can find Jesus there because Jesus is the ark, that we are saved from God's judgment. So what happens is Noah builds the ark, and the ark saves, whatever's inside the ark is saved from the water. The water is God's judgment. The ark floats on top of the water. And if you take into the New Testament, the spiritual truth is that Jesus is the ark, that when we are saved, we are brought into his body and sealed permanently, and we float on top of God's judgment, not drowning or dying as a result. And you can even see Jesus walks on water in the New Testament, just like Noah floats on water as well. And there's even more to that, because Jesus is called the olive, the olive branch. There's so many mentions to olive, and when you take olive oil floats on top of water. So that you can go super deep with that. And then lastly, we'll look at the Passover. This one is the lamb, the sacrifice of the lamb. And the Passover, says, God says, take an innocent lamb, put its blood on your door, the sides and the top, and as a result, the angel of death will pass over you. Well, in Jesus, he's the innocent lamb, he dies, and then if you have his blood in the spirits, the angel of death will pass over you. So it's a very clear correlation there. And even, I just learned this yesterday actually, at the final supper, when they're at the Last Supper table for the Passover, the custom would have been that there would be an innocent lamb there, but it was missing. And you see it in the pictures, and it mentions it, I think I didn't read the details, but I know you see all the paintings, the lamb is missing. However, Jesus is sitting there in the middle of the table, he is the sacrificial lamb for the Passover in the spiritual. This is the physical and in the spiritual. So yeah, that's, before it gets too crazy, too long, that's kind of a good general summary, that if you approach the Bible from the lens of looking for Jesus in everything, including the Old Testament, this makes the Old Testament much more readable, much more enjoyable, because now it's like a scavenger hunt. You got something to look for. You've got something to be how is this going to relate? How is Jesus the main character in this story? And you really start to get these unlocks where you're very excited. It's very It's very rewarding to find those things and to see that. Because all these stories, you hear them in Sunday school as a kid, and it's like, oh, that's cool. You get to be the main character and you get to feel good about this. But actually, it's even more of a deep spiritual revelation, and it builds your faith much more to see that Jesus is the one that did all of the heroic deeds in the Old Testament, and he also did the same things in the Spirit. So yeah.